I'd like to begin by thanking all of you for taking some time out of your day to hear me speak about my book. When one works on a book for a decade, one of the great anxieties is that once it's out, you want people to read it, and so I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about it. Hopefully, enough to interest you to grab it out of the library at some point. I'd also like to say sort of a special moment to be sort of reunited with Ian. It's kind of appropriate that the date of this seminar is nearly 20 years, almost to the month that I arrived in Glasgow. And Ian was one of my very first friends and intellectual companions in Glasgow. And we have managed to, off and on, to carry on a conversation over that 20 years. So I'm really delighted to see Ian again and to resume our conversation. With that, let me get stuck in and say that the central objective of the book is to uncover presuppositions of international order that originate in medieval theology. I argue that theological ideas did not simply fall away once God had been banished from the cathedral of international thought, but rather these ideas are still productive in the sense that they shape the questions we ask about international order as well as the way in which we answer them. I argue further that familiar ways of thinking about international order are correctly interpreted as a worldly application of a theological pattern. Now, before proceeding any further, I want to issue 3 points of clarification. And the first of those points relates to how I understand political theology in the book, because political theology is not a simple concept. That there are different ways of understanding it. Political theology, as I deploy it in the book, involves analyzing politics. For example, institutional arrangements, sources of authority, justifications, and purposes of rule in the context of theological concepts and categories. That brings me to my second point of clarification, and that is the book is not itself a work of theology. The argument is historical and philosophical in orientation, and the point I want to make is that the idea of international order has a history that includes theological antecedents. I want to be clear that the book is not a call to faith, and I do not assert that revelation is the proper ground of international relations or how it ought to be studied. The third point of clarification is that I do not propose to provide a synopsis of the book. Given the time that we have, it would be impractical to do so, the result of which I fear would be an overgeneralization and at the end of the day, a pretty uninteresting talk. So instead, what I want to do is I want to touch on and introduce what I think are some of the important themes that I address in the book, themes which I think challenge some of the conventional wisdom about international relations, how we understand it, and so forth. Those themes are, first of all, I want to begin by introducing rival conceptions of order, or two conceptions of order that arise out of medieval theology. From there, I want to move on and address the idea of continuity between medieval and modern in a way that challenges the dominant narrative of international relations, which typically treats medieval and modern as two discrete intellectual continents, and there's not much intellectual commerce between them. And then from there, I want to move on to illustrate admittedly quite briefly, and probably too briefly, about how these theological ideas structure thinking about order in a system of states. And in particular, I want to illustrate it in the context of Kenneth Waltz's neorealism, because that is, for better or worse, one of the most prominent ways of imagining the international system. So with those clarifications, I want to now move on to consider rival conceptions of order. And my point of departure here is a 13th century theological dispute about the nature of God and the extent of his power. And this dispute yielded two distinct conceptions of order, which I argue are present in modern thinking, but present in different ways and also not on equal footing. The first of these theories is the theory of imminent order. Now, this theory is a synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian revelation. The central figure here is Plato, although it's not the Plato of the book that normally comes first in the canon of Western political thought, but rather what I have in mind is the dialogue Timaeus. In Timaeus, we were told a story that the order of the cosmos is the work of a demiurge who brings together pre-existing matter and pre-existing form. Therefore, the visible world is framed in terms of eternal forms that dictate a rationally intelligible pattern of place and purpose. And individual things contribute to the perfection of the whole. So this is like the basic idea of order in Timaeus. You have pre-existing matter, pre-existing form, and they come together through the workmanship of the demiurge, and this dictates a rationally intelligible pattern of place and purpose in which individual things contribute to the perfection of the whole. Consequently, and this is a critical point, the world necessarily is what it is. There are no second or companion worlds. As Timaeus explains to Socrates in the dialogue, quote, "There must be one only if the created copy is to accord with the original." The problem with Timaeus is that it contradicts what is written in Genesis, the first line of which says, quote, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." The God in Genesis is no mere craftsman like the demiurge who makes by arranging what already exists. Rather, God is a creator properly so called, who made the universe out of nothing. Now, difficulties notwithstanding, the cosmos-making story of Timaeus was close enough to the creation story of Genesis to facilitate a rapprochement between what is often referred to as Athens and Jerusalem. Hellenized Jews, Philo of Alexandria foremost among them, helped to align the creation story of Genesis with the cosmos making of Timaeus. The general outlines of Philo's position is present in St. Augustine's decisive synthesis of the Neoplatonic God of Athens and the biblical God of Jerusalem. Augustine retains the idea that God created the universe according to a rational plan. However, the forms that guide the work of the demiurge are, for Augustine, located in the divine intellect, the emphasis being on in the divine intellect. Augustine says in this regard, quote, "They," referring to the forms, "must be thought to exist nowhere but in the very mind of the creator." So instead of Timaeus, where you have pre-existing forms that are external to the demiurge, for Augustine, the forms exist in the mind of God, and God creates the universe according to this rational plan contained in the divine intellect. Now, a distinctive conception of order corresponds with this understanding of God. Order is understood as an interconnected whole in which individual things jointly compose a necessary pattern of right order. Moreover, this pattern is luminous to reason, and it's explained with reference both to efficient and final causes, that is, in terms of existence and purpose. It's in terms of these intellectual commitments that Augustine says the tranquility of order consists in, quote, the disposition of equal and unequal things in such a way as to give each its proper place. This idea of proper place, again, everything has a place, an appointed place, and it contributes to the good of the whole. Now we can, we can contrast this understanding of order with the theory of imposed order. This theory reflects an attempt to vindicate God's freedom as against the metaphysical snares of Greek philosophy. In short, the concern of certain theologians was that the rational nature of creation might qualify God's freedom. Hence this idea of, is God subject to the rationality of the universe that he brings into existence? So-called nominalist theologians responded to this problem by prioritizing a biblical conception of God, a God of power and might, when interpreting the creation story. According to this interpretation, God speaks the universe into existence by sheer force of will and the efficient causality of the words, let it be. But vindicating God's freedom in this way came at a cost. It destroyed the rational plan that guided the creative act, as Augustine explained it, the result of which all things visible and invisible, all logical entities, all propositions of truth, all possibility and impossibility were simply mandates of the divine will. Again, a distinctive conception of order corresponds with this understanding of God. It leads to a radically contingent conception of order composed of individual things that have no inherent connection with any other thing. That is to say that everything is a thing considered in itself. Order, to the extent that it exists, is imposed without, in the form of a system of external relations. And knowledge of this pattern of order is acquired by empirical observation and the investigation of efficient causes. In other words, by observing the behavior of things. Now, I realize that I've covered an awful lot of ground to this point, and there's a lot of metaphysics going on in this. So allow me to illustrate what are two very abstract and complex ways of thinking about order with an analogy, the Lego analogy. I suspect that all of you are familiar with the children's toy Lego. Imagine a child, Christmas is coming up, a child gets a Lego kit for Christmas, say a spaceship, for example. And in opening the box of this kit, the child dumps the contents out, and you'll have, all a great assemblage, a heap of different bricks of different colors, different shapes, and so forth. Now, the clever engineers at Lego, though, also provide a set of diagrams that help you guide the child in putting those bricks together so that the child's able to actually build the spaceship. The idea here is that by following the diagrams, all of those, that big heap of jumbled bricks, they come together to form a spaceship, and only a spaceship if you follow the diagrams correctly. And moreover, each and every one of those bricks contributes to the whole, the spaceship. This idea, that's the theory of imminent order, right? The booklet of diagrams is the rational pattern in terms of which these bricks come together to form the spaceship. Now, for anybody who has children, you probably are familiar with the situation that children eventually will get bored with the spaceship, and they might want to take it apart and to build something else. At this point, that booklet of diagrams is of no use. You can throw it in the bin. You don't need it at all. And you can bring those bricks together to form all sorts of different things, perhaps an airplane, or a lorry, a car, a barn, or something else. The point here is that those bricks no longer have a necessary place and purpose that contributes to a spaceship, but they can be made and unmade in innumerable different ways to form whatever the child might imagine. This is this idea of imposed order. It's a contingent arrangement, not a necessary arrangement. I argue that both of these theories of order are present in contemporary international thought. However, the theory of imposed order is the dominant discourse. International order, as most people tend to understand it, is a contingent arrangement. It is something that is made and unmade. However, the theory of imminent order survives as a rhetoric. It's invoked to stabilize the contingency of a constructed world. That is to say, it serves as the halter and bit of unfettered freedom, and in doing so, it limits what can be done in the name of will and artifice. It's important to bear in mind that these theories represent incommensurable positions. They are distinct modes of understanding and explanation that cannot be combined to form a composite account of order. Okay, now having laid out these two rival conceptions of order, I want to move on now to consider I want to move on, and I guess that was sort of intermission or something like that. So now for my my next thing, continuity and change. In a very influential article published some better part of 20 years ago or so, John Ruggie said that the transition from medieval to modern is, quote, the most important contextual change in international politics in this millennium. The most important contextual change, the transition from medieval and modern. I challenge this claim and suggest that the contrast that this contrast is not nearly as great as is often imagined, and in some respects it is substantially wrong. And then challenging this story that IR theorists tell about their subject, I want to suggest that the discourse of continuity is as important as the discourse of change in making sense of the relation between medieval and modern. Indeed, the conventional historical periodization, which I think we're all familiar with, ancient, medieval, and modern, actually obscures threads of continuity. And in that respect, this conventional historical periodization often is an obstacle to understanding international order and the ideas that ground it. Take, for example, pardon me, take, for example, the Italian Renaissance. According to the heroic Burkhardian narrative, the learned sons of the Renaissance emancipated the individual from the dead hand of religion. And in doing so, they threw open the gates of modernity and leaving behind the darkness and the religiosity of the Middle Ages. However, the humanist preoccupation with the affairs of the world did not involve a turn away from religion. Their call for a return to classical learning meant the Christian classics as much as it did pagan writings. The humanist movement had a very important role in transmitting the language and concerns of the theory of imposed order to what we understand as the modern world. Its emphasis on the human capacity to shape the world, the freedom to will and to act, converge with the intellectual commitments of nominalist theology. Therefore, there is continuity here, but it's important as well not to overstate the case. I'm not saying that Renaissance humanism is identical with nominalist theology. Indeed, it's a mistake to equate the two, but it is a fair description, I think, to describe them as representing parallel movements. They emphasize a philosophy of will and an individualism that's rooted in a particular Christian understanding of God, man, and God's relation to the universe, and not in pagan philosophy. We find something similar in the Reformation. The Reformation, we are regularly told, delivered a systemic shock that dissolved the religious and political unity of Latin Christendom. And out of this shock emerged the modern state system. But again, the story that we're typically told is exaggerated. There was a shock, of course, but the Reformation did not lead to what is often described as a great rupture between medieval and modern, again, forming those two discrete intellectual continents. And moreover, the Reformation didn't secularize the modern world in the way that's often claimed. It's possible to detect an inner unity between certain strands of medieval thought and Reformation thought that resonates with nominalist commitments. Again, as is the case with the humanist movement, Luther is no nominalist theologian. In fact, he leveled scathing criticism against William of Ockham on account of his alleged Pelagianism. However, there is a clear and unmistakable nominalist orientation that pervades Luther's thought. He has a thoroughgoing preoccupation with God's freedom and power that's symptomatic of Reformation thought generally. It's important to bear in mind when thinking about the Reformation and its importance, and in particular Luther's importance, that it's not found in a contribution to political theory, but rather Luther played a very important role in transmitting what I call a nominalist mental universe that others would use to theorize politics. Most prominent of all, Thomas Hobbes, the great early modern nominalist thinker. If we take all of this together, this puts the transition from medieval to modern in rather different light. I want to stress that I do not deny evidence of palpable change, but this change needs to be understood within an inherited continuity. By this, I mean there are new interpretations of old ideas that are adapted to new or different problems. And it's in this context that I suggest that modern theories of international order are not constructed on a new plot and out of new building materials, but rather they are constructed, as Michael Allen Gillespie puts it in his book, The Theological Origins of Modernity. It's constructed out of the rubble of the Middle Ages. The medieval abbey had collapsed, it had been torn down, but the stones from that abbey had been refashioned to construct the modern castle. This brings me then to theology and international relations. And here I want to begin with the idea of a system of states, which is generally understood, generically understood, as a complex whole that's formed by the interaction of its constitutive parts. Now, the core problem of such a system is reconciling the demands of freedom with the requirements of order, and that this problem parallels the theological problem of reconciling God's freedom with the regular order of nature. It's in this context that we encounter the language of imposed order and this recurring parallel. Again, I want to recall those basic postulates of that theory. Reality is composed of singular things that have no connection to any other, no necessary connection to any other thing. External relations are imposed from without, and the pattern of relations that are imposed are explained with reference to efficient causes. When these postulates are translated into the language of international relations, we encounter something that I suspect that will be familiar to all of you. Independent states in a condition of anarchy, relations established through a balance of power or rules of law. And this pattern of order is explained by empirical observation of state behavior. This parallel can be drawn out further by revisiting Samuel Clarke's defense of God's freedom in his famous exchange with Leibniz. Clarke argued that God doesn't create the universe and then retire from the scene, having set the machine of the universe in motion. On the contrary, Clarke says that God not only creates the universe, but he actively upholds and governs the order of the universe. And it's here that we encounter an important difference between human beings and God. Human beings compose independently of the forces that govern what is made. I can illustrate, or rather I want to illustrate this point in the context of Isaac Newton's natural philosophy, which, as it happens, was a great influence for Samuel Clarke and something that he was quite anxious to defend. Now, Newton explained the motion of the heavenly bodies with reference to the law of gravity. Everybody, I think, is familiar with that. But Newton was also clear in saying that in order to explain the motion of the heavenly bodies, it was not necessary to provide an account or assign a cause to gravity. All that was necessary was to know the effect that gravity produced. So you can say that we can know the motion of Venus, or that Venus will appear in the sky at a certain place and a certain time due to certain laws of nature. But there's no need to explain the cause of those laws. Again, all that you need to know is the effect that the law of gravity produces. Now, God is quite different in this respect. God composes not merely within an order of secondary causes, as Newton does, but he is both the author and preserver of the forces or powers that move what he makes. Now, let me then illustrate this in the context of international relations and order. Kenneth Waltz, one of the most influential international theorists of the 20th century, composes a theory without assigning a cause to its moving force. The structure of the state system, he says, consists in an order of secondary causes that shapes and shoves the behavior of states, that explains certain law-like regularities, like the search for autonomy, recurring balances of power, the persistence of war, and so forth. Acquiring knowledge of these regularities does not depend on an account of the force that moves the system. Like Newton, it's enough to know this force causes certain effects. But to hold all of this together, there's a concealed theological move that's necessary to sustain the coherence of the theory. In other words, Waltz composes a theory that explains certain regularities of international relations, but he also needs to stipulate and uphold the force that moves the system, namely states act to ensure their survival. He simply says, this is an assumption, and to assume is to stipulate or to will. It's at this point that the theorist takes on the role of God to complete the theory, not as an artificer who composes within an order of secondary causes, but as a creator or first cause who wills the force that governs the system. It's in this sense that Waltz establishes a conceptual order, and it endures so long as he sees fit. That is, so long as it's deemed to be useful, just as God, the author of nature, condescends to uphold laws that ground the regular order of nature. Now, we find something quite similar with the constitutionalization of a state system. Now, we don't have much time, so I just want to provide just the briefest of sketches to provide you a flavor of what I'm getting at here. This constitutionalization of the state system is also intelligible as a worldly application of nominalist theology. In this case, though, the language is slightly different. It's not the balance of power that's central, but rather states are related in terms of rules of law and self-imposed obligations underwritten by consent. Now, I suspect this leads to what I suspect is a familiar story. The victory of law over anarchy regularizes freedom and strengthens social bonds, and that this takes place in a matrix of individualism, voluntarism, and empiricism. That is to say, states are free to make and unmake arrangements in pursuit of common and contingent goals. There's a number of examples I could give, but since this is a law audience, Brierley will have to do. Brierley conceives states as juristic persons, and their separateness is translated into unity by an apparatus of external relations that's expressed in terms of rights, obligations, and consent, as I said a moment ago. But when Brierley gets to that big question, what it ultimately explains the binding force of law, he does the same thing as Waltz. He resorts to assumption, stipulation, and belief. He says, and I quote, "Man is constrained insofar as he is a reasonable being to believe that order and not chaos is the governing principle of the world in which he has to live." There's nothing more than that, belief. So this brings me then to a conclusion, and the conclusion is to illustrate or draw out a dilemma. I've said that the theory of imposed order is the dominant discourse. Its preoccupation with freedom raises a searching question, however. In a purely constructed world, a world that's nothing but will and artifice, can anything be truly universal? And it's in response to this question that the discourse of imminent order survives as a rhetoric. It's invoked to limit what can be done in the name of will and artifice. But there's a problem here. And that problem is that there comes a point when this theological inheritance that I've been concerned to excavate begins to unravel. Because today, IR theorists and international lawyers, they no longer appeal to God to guarantee the regularity of order. Therefore, it's necessary to find a substitute to alleviate and to relieve the anxiety of uncertainty. This can be illustrated in Michael Barnett's account of humanitarianism. Barnett says that the discourse of humanity points to something greater than us. It imparts a transcendent character that fixes the contingency of a constructed world. But when he moves to account for the authority of humanity, he says it's impossible to study humanitarianism apart from religious discourse. Indeed, he says, and I quote, "Humanitarianism begins and ends with faith. It sustains and is sustained by faith." Now, the structure of this argument tracks the theory of imposed order and the commitments of nominalist theology. However, it's meant to perform the work of imminent order. The point here is that the idea of humanity, as Barnett elaborates it, has no intrinsic reason. Its authority is supported by nothing more than an assertion of will, just as the God of nominalist theology mandated physical and moral laws of nature. And it's here that we encounter this deep-seated fundamental indeterminacy of contemporary international order. Of course, reconciling the demands of freedom and the requirements of order, that core problem, can be grounded in more than one postulate. God is no longer the big answer. Rational autonomy can be inserted in place of God, or common humanity, or environmental stewardship, or something else. Yet this ground, these alternative postulates, is no more secure than before. When human decision takes the place of God, arbitrariness is an indelible feature of a world that is nothing more than a human construction. Moreover, there's no definitive way of resolving disagreement between different postulates, in part because the cognitive status of rational investigation is, at the end of the day, no different than belief in God. As Leo Strauss put it in addressing this issue, quote, "Philosophy, the quest for evident and necessary knowledge, rests itself on an unevident decision, on an act of the will, just as faith does." So where does this all lead? 3 very brief points. The first is that in uncovering this theological inheritance, we demythologize the field of international relations. And if I could intrude on your ground somewhat, I would say international law as well, or at least parts of it. And in doing so, we understand ourselves better than we do. And I think understanding ourselves better than we do is critically important in opening space for a truly globalized study of international relations. Because international relations, the discipline of international relations, tends to assume that its fundamental concepts, its vocabulary, anarchy, balance of power, that these are analytically neutral. And I want to suggest that they're anything but. They're historical, they're particular, and in some respects, they're deeply entangled with the Christian religion. The second point is that modern theories of international order might not be secular in the way that they're normally imagined to be. And it's here I think we need to take seriously that theological ideas, despite the many pronouncements that God is dead, continue to exert considerable influence on modern international thought. And lastly, I think it's important that this research leads to the important point that Christian culture shapes Western theories of international order to a much greater extent than many theorists realize. And this has enormously important implications for a world that is no longer predominantly Western or Christian, and how it's theorized.